you back to the conference. And it's nice to hear this buzz this early in the morning, this energy, which we will have transferred to our panel. My name is Gerard Atching, and I'm in the Department of Romance Studies, and I'm also the Director of Africana. And it's my pleasure to introduce this panel this morning, which is called the South of Diaspora, Francophone Literatures. And we have 4 speakers who we're very eager to listen to this morning. And what I will do is I will give their names, their titles, so that they will just follow the order as you have the order here in the program. So the first speaker will be Salim Ayoub from the University of Miami, and the title of his paper is Immigration, Global Influence and Alienation in the Literature of the South, the Case of Fatou Diom, Le Ventre de l'Atlantique, followed by Céline Cordia from McGill University, and the title of her paper is In Search of the Afropean Soul. Our third speaker is Jackqueline Frost from here at Cornell University, and the title of her paper is The Sheer Tremendous Tidal Wave of Desperate Living, which is a quote, Édouard Glissant, Créolité, and the US South. And finally, Jonathan Solarte Espinosa from Harvard University, and the title of his paper is Tyranny of the Border, the Trujillo Massacre and the Modern Colonial Gender Binary in Edwidge Dantikas, The Farming of Bones. So without further ado, I'd like to have them come up here, and then we'll have time for questions afterward. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
I only turned 20, so there might not be enough for people. If you could share with someone here close by. I didn't know. Hi everyone. It looks like people are mostly done. Okay. I'd like to thank you all for coming. My colleagues in Romance Studies and also the scholars who are visiting. Thank you so much for being here. My talk is called The Sheer Tremendous Tidal Wave of Desperate Living. I think, I don't have it written here, which is a quote of Faulkner. And I'll be talking about Édouard Glissant, Créolité, and the US South. At the end of last century, Martinican poet and philosopher Édouard Glissant proposed in the milieu of black scholars in the US Deep South a re-evaluation of the work of William Faulkner, claiming that, quote, the principle of the whole work is indisputable, what is founded on slavery and oppression can't last. While Faulkner's racism is equally indisputable, Glissant asserts that we must negotiate his ability to, quote, persuade the reality of the South to yield to a higher meaning or sense of becoming, end quote. The South's link to the Caribbean and Latin America as points united by the plantation system and its legacies must be interrogated, as Glissant claims, by the impossible refusal of connection between whites, blacks, and Indians in the Faulknerian epic, which hinges at every point on the malediction of disturbed filiation, which is what I'll be talking about today. He argues that between the South's deferred disclosure and the role of contagion, we may derive a necessary analysis of relation, which, as some of you may know, is Glissant's arch concept, in what Glissant calls the, quote, stormy connection of one race to another, which I think is an amazing understatement. I'd like to begin with an anecdote. My childhood friend Philip Fry is a park ranger and oral historian at the Longfellow Evangeline Historic Site in St. Martinville, Louisiana. It's the alleged location of the resettlement of the French-Acadian exiles from their colony in Nova Scotia in the 18th century. These colonists would, in the next 200 years, lay the basis of Cajun culture in southern Louisiana, a Francophone agrarian society that was isolated from American industry, language, and culture until the second half of the 20th century. Philip and I both grew up in that culture. He related to me once that the historical society that oversees the historic site puts a decisive emphasis on Cajun settlement in the area. It reproduces, Cajun shacks with statues of the Virgin Mary, and you have Cajun people reenacting 18th century Cajun life, making butter, weaving, that sort of thing. So the fact that the central feature of the historic site is a plantation house, and that the entire Bayou Teche area was in fact large-scale indigo and later sugar cane plantation, this, in Philip's opinion, keeps the historic site from being at all representative of any possible historical reality, since the number of enslaved Africans far outstripped what was in comparison a minute society of poor but free farmers. It seems that the historical society's historical denial, arising from their charge to preserve what by all accounts is a dying culture, necessitates that in part the fantasy of Cajun history be subtended by the erasure of slavery. That's what it seems like. But what is sure, and curiously unaccounted for, is that theirs are fields where blacks labored to death. The problematic of historical thinking that I have described above, by which my person is also annotated, contains what Glissant calls the impossible refusal of creolization. What is refused, but in vain, is the material, cultural, and familial exchanges that took place over several centuries since contact in the Americas, especially those activated by the kidnapping and transportation of Africans, the immigration and land monopolization of Europeans, and the displacement and unsuccessful genocide of indigenous Americans. The multiple and overlapping presences of these three groups in the territories of the Americas enabled a situation of inextricability that we are familiar from other places in the plantation system and indeed the colonial system at large. While these exchanges can be perceived in the individual as well as on the scale of the family and culture, it is the peculiarity of the American racial imaginary that denies at any cost a métissage that has nonetheless already taken place. I would like to discuss the contours of this impossible refusal that for Glissant characterizes the creolization of the US Southern social ecology. I will do so by considering deferred disclosure and contamination, the two primary and opposed axes of this phenomenon. In particular, I'm interested in tracing the violence refused creolization engenders, violence being the sheer or transparent element of the generalized desperation that is Faulkner's subject. I wanted to begin this way because this is how I understand Glissant to proceed in the writing of Faulkner, Mississippi, which, while often described as a monograph, and is only one at that, is an errant memoir that captures not only Glissant's reading of Faulkner's works, but weaves this reading with his conversations, his frustrations, and his encounters as an Antillean teaching in the Deep South in the 1990s, traveling between southern Louisiana and Faulkner's County. It captures anecdotal reflections as well. Of note, Glissant writes, parentheses, one emphatically says the South with a capital S, as if it represents an absolute, as though we other people of the South, to the south of this capitalized South, never existed. Whether it's Yoknap-Taufa or Jefferson, the spaces through which Glissant moves are subject to the same dilemma of concealment. In Glissant's visit to Roanoke, the plantation house of Faulkner's family, which was, quote, ruined by the War of Secession, he will tell us that, quote, memory belongs only to objects, end quote, which is to say it doesn't belong to people. He is moving through the plantation house and saying, quote, here memory is selective, rid of the whiff of slavery, no trace of slave shacks, end quote. But it is precisely this selectivity, this obvious orchestration of memory, that discloses through its manipulation a profound secret. It is in this way that Faulkner will proceed, quote, hiding everything while revealing it, the deferral of the South's damnation. Like many of Glissant's concepts, creolization is derived from cultural and experiential phenomena and elaborated to function at various levels of abstraction. Métissage for Glissant was insufficient to describe the paradigm of interchange that occurred without cooperation and elicited more than a simple mixture. Therefore, he employed creolization in order to discuss the radical inextricability of cultural exchange beyond the basic additive logic of synthesis. Creolization is, quote, an aggressive will to deformation, an immense plasticity that continually hybridizes, end quote. Glissant's concept of creolization, despite the omnipresence of its possible reference in the Antillean spaces of the world, is curiously co-constitutive with his thinking on Faulkner and the US South. In Faulkner, Mississippi, he defines creolization as, quote, the unstoppable conjunction, despite misery, oppression, and lynching, the conjunction that opens up torrents of unpredictable results. Elsewhere, he will claim that creolization is both irreversible, which is to say that there is no démétissage, even if it can be deterritorialized, which is something we should talk about. But more importantly, it is characterized by the aleatory insofar as the effects of the mix are radically unforeseeable. So by impossibly refused creolization, we mean the always unsuccessful rejection of a creolization in process. It therefore involves a very thorough denial that structures the social ecology of the South. The highest value of refused creolization, I argue, is to organize and dispense existence and non-existence, which is to say social life and social death. I would also add real life and real death, so as to enforce what Saidiya Hartman describes as, quote, the absolute distinction between the free white person and the black captive, and to maintain black submission. But denial, rejection, or refusal, as it is perceived at every level of effective life in the Deep South, is the expression that reveals interpolation at every level, even if denial allows this interpolation to be deferred. In the Deep South, segregation, by which I mean the subjection of racialized groups to the violent exclusions of those that dominate them, prevails to this day, a confirmation of the ongoing process by which persons or cultures are powerfully situated within the legacy of slavery. The phenomena of refused creolization, resulting in what Faulkner will call damnation, differs significantly from the processes of racialization in the northern part of the US and from other parts of the plantation system. In this way, the Deep South, perhaps especially Louisiana, where we might venture a claim that creolization is the most intensive, is maintained as a white habitat. In one example, Glissant relates a piece of news he's read during his time in Louisiana. Quote, in March 1996, 130 parishioners in Thomasville, Georgia, all of them white, demanded that the little coffin of a baby, Whitney Elaine Johnson, be dug up and transferred somewhere else. It's a 100% white cemetery here. Whitney's mother is white and her father black. We don't allow blacks in our cemetery. And as I was talking to Jeff earlier, and this is very common, but I think that it's worth noting this is 1996 also. Refused creolization is all the more terrifying because it demands through its violence that we take seriously a desperately mythologized reality of an undisturbed line of white descent. According to Glissant, the white community of the South cannot be achieved without crisis, since while having identity, the culture of white supremacy, I would say, they do not have legitimacy, which is to say the autonomy and power that is understood within the framework of secession. They are an eternally defeated people, and this defeat is reconciled at the level of culture through tragic deferral. That is, the deferral of a reality that cannot be absolutely refused, since there is no solution to the problem of illegitimacy in the South's foundation. Deferral is, according to Glissant, that which allows Faulkner to, quote, arrange the work in the shadow of questions to which he gives no answer. This movement of deferral and disclosure, of concealment, promised revelation, and reconcealment fails to provide resolution, but precisely through this failure to speak, Faulkner unconceals the reality of disturbed filiation. And filiation, for Glissant, means simply the tracing of lineage from father to son across generations, but it indexes a material and philosophical obsession and anxiety. So we can talk about that later if we like. In, quote, tirelessly taking the side of the South, Faulkner's work nonetheless shows slavery to produce a foundation against itself, such that it can be called ana-foundational in the sense that Fred Moten has recently used it to describe the slave trade. The Faulknerian epic, too, is ana-foundational insofar it is built on the lack of a foreseeable outcome for the community. There is no transformation of the collective threat into renewed vitality. There's only ever danger, and this danger is spoken only through deferral. The people of the county dwell, which is to say, make a habitat of, quote, not only the most miserable reality, but the torment that deepens this misery and confers a grandeur upon it. What interests Glissant is that Faulkner's is an epic of difficult relation. The principle of tragic deferred disclosure organizes the Faulknerian epic of disturbed filiation, which by exposing contamination in the social ecology allows us to explore the heteronymous effects of confluences that for Glissant, quote, always partake of marginality. In Poétique de la Relation, Glissant writes, quote, it is impossible to establish a line of descent and guarantee its legitimacy. Disaffiliation prevails. Everything collapses in a nebulous black bloodline, useless and uncertain, diffuse and without object, already lost in the beyond, in the world, in the evanescent. The power of the novel derives from contamination, end quote. For Glissant, contamination, rather than autonomy, provides a way of thinking the reality of creolized confrontation in the history of colonization in the West, and gives shape to the form of resistance available to the colonized. Glissant proposes that whereas classicisms partake of intolerance, for us, the substitute for the hidden violence of these intolerant exclusions, of filiation, is the manifest and integrating violence of contaminations. Creolization occasions an understanding of decolonization that accommodates historical exchanges composed of aleatory effects that are shared without cooperation. From the philosophical framework of cultural autonomy, which has and continues to facilitate claims to decolonization, it is difficult to speak of, quote, cultures whose composition did not result from a unity of norms, but rather was built in the margins, thrust headlong into the world by necessity, oppression, anguish, greed, end quote. To conclude, it remains to be seen if the tragic disclosure and contamination of which Glissant writes in Faulkner, Mississippi, can be extended to a deep Southern minor literature, a minor poetics, or a minor music. The ability to find this minor music in what Glissant will call the pure extremity of abstraction into which Faulkner writes demonstrates the capacity for literature not only to explore, but to reveal the hidden life and becoming of social reality. Quote, inextricability can be confronted. Faulkner has shown it is expressible, end quote. It is this reality in my own thinking for which literature is most essential and where its demands are most insistent. At the end of Faulkner, Mississippi, Glissant writes, quote, would it be better to delve into his works and simply to enjoy them without asking questions? But this is where we live, subject to our damnations, our giving voice to our revolt. We cannot abstract ourselves.